In the heart of North America, a silent crisis is brewing, one that threatens the livelihoods of farmers, the stability of industries, and the trust between two of the continent's closest allies. The U.S. dairy industry, a cornerstone of American agriculture, is reeling from a trade dispute with Canada that has spiraled into a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe. At the center of this storm is Canada's tariff rate quota, TRQ system, a policy designed to protect its domestic farmers but now accused of strangling U.S. dairy exports. The numbers are staggering. A 245.5% tariff on cheese and a jaw-dropping 298.5% on butter for any imports exceeding Canada's quota limits. These aren't just taxes, they're economic barricades, turning potential profits into crushing losses and leaving tons of mozzarella, cheddar, and powdered milk stranded at the border or dumped at bargain prices in the U.S. market. This isn't a simple tale of tariffs and quotas, it's a saga of competing economic philosophies, broken trade promises, and the ripple effects of protectionism. The U.S., with its sprawling dairy farms and export-driven model, stands in stark contrast to Canada's tightly controlled supply management system, which prioritizes price stability and local production. When the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, replaced NAFTA in 2020, American dairy farmers and exporters hoped for a fairer shot at Canada's lucrative market. They expected a more transparent allocation of import quotas, allowing their products to flow freely across the border. Instead, they found themselves locked out, with quotas largely reserved for Canadian retail giants like Loblaws and Metro, leaving U.S. companies scrambling. The U.S. Dairy Export Council has called this a subtle form of discrimination, a breach of the open market spirit the USMCA was meant to embody. The fallout is devastating. In just 18 months, the U.S. dairy industry has hemorrhaged over $7 billion, according to a June 2025 report from the U.S. Dairy Export Council. Direct losses, canceled contracts, storage costs, and discounted sales account for $3 billion, while indirect losses, including plummeting milk prices and job cuts, add another $4 billion. In Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Idaho, cold storage facilities are overflowing with unsold cheese, and farmers are bearing the brunt. A Pennsylvania farm with 400 cows, once a model of stability, saw its income plummet by 28% as raw milk prices dropped from $17 to $12 per 100 pounds. Nearly half of mid-sized U.S. dairy farms reported losses in the first half of 2025, and the crisis shows no signs of abating. Without access to Canada's market, once the second largest for U.S. dairy exports, the industry faces a grim future of declining investments, layoffs, and potential bankruptcies. Canada defends its system, arguing it adheres to USMCA commitments while safeguarding its farmers. Yet the opacity of its quota allocation process has fueled accusations of protectionism. The U.S. has pushed back, with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative demanding reform, but progress is slow. An $850 million emergency aid package from the U.S. government in May 2025 covers less than 12% of the losses, a drop in the bucket for an industry on the brink. Taking the dispute to the World Trade Organization, WTO, or renegotiating USMCA terms are options, but both require time and political will, scarce commodities in an election year. If unresolved, this trade rift could sever a vital economic artery, threatening not just dairy but the broader trust between two nations long seen as models of cooperation. This dairy dilemma is just one thread in a larger tapestry of trade tensions weaving through U.S.-Canada relations. The stakes escalated in July 2025 when President Donald Trump imposed a 35% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing economic security. Canada retaliated swiftly, slapping a 50% tariff on $22 billion worth of U.S. goods, including electric vehicle motors and Ford F-Series pickup truck frames. This wasn't a knee-jerk reaction but a calculated strategy. Canada rolled out a three-pronged approach: immediate tariffs, a $4.8 billion green steel fund to modernize its industry, and legislation mandating domestic steel for federal projects. The results were immediate. Steel prices in the U.S. surged, with the Midwest cold-rolled steel index climbing $60 per ton to $1,060, and aluminum rolls hitting $3,500 per ton, the highest since 2022. The Midwest premium for aluminum jumped 54%, and analysts warn it could reach 70 cents per pound if negotiations stall. The impact reverberates through the U.S. economy. Ford estimates that the tariffs, combined with new labor contracts, could inflate the cost of each F-150 pickup by up to $8,000, a burden that could price out buyers in key electoral battlegrounds like the Midwest. Beer prices are also at risk, as aluminum costs drive up the price of cans, forcing brands like Modelo and Budweiser to cut promotions. The Anderson Economic Group estimates that U.S. consumers face an additional $30 billion in annual costs from these tariffs alone. Meanwhile, Canada's steel industry is thriving, with domestic consumption projected to rise by 2.5 million tons in 2025, fueled by public investments in wind energy and green transportation. The United Steelworkers Union in Canada hailed the tariffs as a shield for jobs, while Michigan's auto workers warned of shift cuts as production costs soar. This tit-for-tat trade war isn't new. It's been simmering since 2022, when the U.S. first targeted Canadian steel with tariffs. Canada's response then was measured, investing $1.2 billion to modernize its steel industry with electric arc furnaces, reducing emissions and export reliance. The Bloomberg Metal Index reported a 9% spike in cold-rolled steel prices within weeks of Canada tightening its exports. And Morgan Stanley noted that each Ford Bronco's production cost could rise by $1,800. In the U.S., factories in Flint and Toledo are rotating shifts, and Indiana's auto industry is halting expansion plans amid unpredictable costs. While Canada's steel sector powers renewable energy projects, the U.S. assembly sector, where most jobs are created, faces mounting pressure. Energy adds another layer to this complex rivalry. On June 30, 2025, Canada made history by exporting liquefied natural gas, LNG, to South Korea from Kitimat, British Columbia, bypassing U.S. pipelines. This $40 billion LNG Canada project, backed by Shell, Petronas and others, marks a seismic shift in Canada's energy strategy. By targeting Asian markets like Japan and South Korea, which are seeking alternatives to Russian gas, Canada is reducing its dependence on the U.S., where 95% of its gas exports once flowed. Priced at $1.10 per MMBtu, nearly a third of the U.S. Henry Hub price, Canadian LNG is a game-changer. The project not only boosts Canada's economy, creating thousands of jobs and $23 billion in government revenue, but also strengthens its geopolitical leverage within the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The U.S. has responded with its own energy tariffs, including a 10% levy on Canadian natural gas, prompting Canada to accelerate its pivot to Asia. This move underscores a broader truth. Trade disputes are not just about economics but about long-term strategy. Canada's LNG push is a counterpunch to U.S. policies, forcing Washington to rethink its energy import strategy. Yet environmental concerns loom large. The International Institute for Sustainable Development warns that Canada's rapid LNG expansion could undermine its greenhouse gas reduction goals, turning ambitious climate promises into green tokens. As if dairy, steel and energy weren't enough, pharmaceuticals have emerged as the latest battleground. In July 2025, President Trump announced a staggering 200% tariff on imported pharmaceuticals, effective August 1st, aimed at forcing production back to the U.S. With 80 to 90% of active pharmaceutical ingredients coming from China and India, the impact could be catastrophic. U.S. hospitals and insurers warn of 15 to 25% healthcare cost increases, with drug prices potentially rising 6 to 8 times for biologics, insulin, and cancer treatments. The American Hospital Association has flagged the risk of drug shortages by early 2026, particularly for elderly patients reliant on affordable generics. Canada, a key pharmaceutical supplier, has taken a strategic approach. Prime Minister Mark Carney, leveraging his experience as former governor of the Bank of England, secured a $1.2 billion support package for domestic drug companies and activated a strategic reserve of 200 essential medicines. Unlike Australia, which publicly challenged the U.S. tariffs, Canada opted for quiet diplomacy, seeking a waiver while refusing to compromise on affordable medicine access. Carney's stance is clear. Canada is not the U.S. adversary, but it won't bow to terms that harm its citizens. This delicate balancing act reflects Canada's broader strategy, stretching negotiations to make Trump's pressure tactics a political liability in an election year. The pharmaceutical tariff also threatens U.S. allies like Australia, a top 5 exporter of plasma and vaccines worth $2 billion annually. Australia's refusal to alter its pharmaceutical benefits scheme, despite U.S. pressure, has strained relations, marking the highest tension in over 2 decades. Japan and South Korea face similar 25% tariffs on all exports, with Trump's diplomatic threat mail signaling strategic uncertainty. Investors fear this approach, successful in steel and autos, may backfire in a sector as sensitive as healthcare. At its core, this multifaceted trade war reveals a deeper struggle between free market ideals and protectionist instincts. The U.S. champions open markets but lacks the enforcement tools to protect its exporters' Mondays, while Canada's supply management and tariff policies prioritize domestic stability over international commitments. Both sides are entrenched, and the cost is mounting. $7 billion in dairy losses, $30 billion in consumer costs from steel tariffs, and untold billions more in potential healthcare price hikes. The trust that once defined U.S.-Canada trade is eroding, replaced by a cycle of retaliation and escalation. The solution lies not in cash aid or trade courts, but in strategic diplomacy. The U.S. must diversify its export markets, Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, while Canada must reform its quota system to align with international agreements. Without these shifts, the $7 billion dairy crisis and the $22 billion steel retaliation will become textbook cases of how protectionism can derail entire industries. For now, farmers, workers, and consumers bear the cost, while the trust between two of North America's oldest allies hangs in the balance. As the U.S. heads into an election year and Canada doubles down on its domestic priorities, the question looms: can these neighbors find a path back to cooperation, or will the silent crises of dairy, steel, energy, and pharmaceuticals become the new normal?